Chapter 3. Red Hair. Next day, Marilla didn't tell Anne about her conversation with Matthew. She gave Anne a lot of work in the kitchen.
"Marilla," said Anne excitedly, "I have to know about my future. Please tell me. Are you going to send me away?"
"No," said Marilla. "You can stay at Green Gables with Matthew and me, but you have to be good." Anne started to cry. "Why are you crying?" asked Marilla in surprise. "Don't you want to stay with us? Don't you like Green Gables?"
"Oh, yes, Marilla," cried Anne. "I like it very much. I'm crying because I'm very happy. And I'll always be good."
Some days later, Mrs. Lynde came to tea with Marilla. When she arrived, Anne was outside. Marilla and Mrs. Lynde sat in the kitchen and talked.
"I think you're making a mistake," said Mrs. Lynde. "You don't know anything about children."
"No, but I can learn," said Marilla. Anne ran into the kitchen. She saw Mrs. Lynde and stopped.
"The Cuthberts didn't take you for your pretty face," Mrs. Lynde said. "She's very thin, Marilla, and her hair is as red as carrots. Come here, child. I want to see you."
Anne ran across the kitchen and stood in front of Mrs. Lynde. Her face was red and angry.
"I hate you," she cried. "I hate you! I hate you!"
"Anne," cried Marilla.
"You're a very rude woman," Anne told Mrs. Lynde. "And you're fat."
"Anne, go to your room," said Marilla. "Wait for me there." Anne started to cry. Then she ran upstairs. Mrs. Lynde got up from her chair.
"I'm going home now, Marilla," she said. "That child is very wild. You'll have a lot of problems with her."
"But you said unkind things about her," said Marilla. After Mrs. Lynde went home, Marilla went upstairs. Why did Anne say those things? She thought unhappily. Now Mrs. Lynde will tell everybody in Avonlea about her. "Stop crying and listen to me, Anne," she said. "You were very rude to Mrs. Lynde. She was a visitor in my home."
"But she was very unkind," said Anne.
"I want you to say sorry to Mrs. Lynde," said Marilla.
"Never," said Anne. "I'm not sorry."
Marilla remembered something. When she was a child, her aunts often talked about her. "Marilla isn't a very pretty little girl," they said. "Maybe Mrs. Lynde was unkind," said Marilla quietly, "but you have to say sorry. Stay here in your room." Next morning, Anne didn't come down to breakfast. Marilla told Matthew the story. "She was very rude," she said.
"But Marilla," said Matthew, "Mrs. Lynde doesn't think before she speaks. Please don't be angry with Anne."
Anne stayed in her room all day. Marilla took food upstairs, but Anne didn't eat very much. In the evening, Matthew went quietly up to Anne's room. Anne was on a chair by the window. She looked very small and unhappy. Matthew felt very sorry for her. He closed the door.
"Please go and say sorry to Mrs. Lynde, Anne," he said.
"All right, Matthew," said Anne. "I wasn't sorry yesterday, but I'm sorry now. I'll do it because you asked me."
"Good," said Matthew happily. "It's very quiet downstairs without you, Anne."
He went quietly out of the room. Later, Marilla and Anne walked to Mrs. Lynde's house.
"I'm very, very sorry, Mrs. Lynde," said Anne. "I was very rude to you. You were right about my red hair, and I am thin and ugly."
Mrs. Lynde smiled.
"I was rude to you, too," she said. "You do have red hair, but maybe it will change color when you're older."
"That's very kind of you, Mrs. Lynde," said Anne. "Now I can hope for prettier hair. Please, can I go outside and play?"
"Yes, of course," said Mrs. Lynde. "Find some flowers."
Anne went out and closed the door behind her. Anne is really sorry, thought Marilla. But she's funny, too.
"She's a strange little girl," said Mrs. Lynde to Marilla. "But she isn't a bad child. I like her."
On the way home, Anne suddenly put her small hand into Marilla's hand.
"I love Green Gables, Marilla," she said. "It's my home now."
Chapter 4. The Party. Anne had only one ugly dress from the orphanage, so Marilla made her 3 new dresses. She bought a little hat for Anne, too. But Anne didn't like the new clothes. "Why don't you like them, Anne?" asked Marilla.
They're not pretty," answered Anne.
"But they're very good dresses," said Marilla.
Marilla went to church every Sunday. She wanted to take Anne with her. But the next Sunday, Marilla was sick. "Can you go to church without me?" she asked Anne.
"Yes, of course, Marilla," answered Anne.
She put on one of her new dresses and her hat and started walking down the road to church.
"I don't like this hat," she thought. "It isn't very pretty."
Then she had an idea. There were a lot of beautiful yellow flowers by the road. Anne put some flowers on her hat. When she arrived at church, the other children looked at her.
"That girl's crazy," they said.
After church, Anne ran back to Green Gables. "Did you enjoy it, Anne?" asked Marilla.
"Not very much," said Anne. "The minister talked for a long time, but he wasn't very interesting. But there's going to be a party next week for the children of Avonlea. That's exciting. Please, Marilla, can I go too?"
"Yes, of course," answered Marilla.
"Oh, thank you, Marilla," said Anne.
She put her arms around Marilla. Marilla felt happy. "I'm starting to love this child," she thought. Marilla had a beautiful old brooch. The day before the party, she couldn't find it. "It was on top of the desk in my room," she thought. "But now it isn't there. Where is it?" "Did you take my brooch out of my room?" she asked Anne.
"No, Marilla," said Anne. "I went into your room last week. I saw the brooch on top of the desk and put it on my dress. But then I put it back on the desk. I didn't take it out of your room."
Marilla looked for the brooch again, but she couldn't find it. "Anne," she said, "I'll ask you again. Did you take the brooch from my room and lose it?"
"No, I didn't, Marilla," said Anne quietly.
"Go to your room and stay there,"
said Marilla. Anne went to her room. Later, Marilla went to see her.
"Marilla, the party is tomorrow," Anne said. "Please, can I go?"
"No," said Marilla angrily. "Tell me about the brooch first."
"But I told you about the brooch, Marilla," cried Anne.
Next morning, Marilla took Anne's breakfast upstairs. Anne sat on her bed. Her face was white, and her big gray eyes shone.
"I'll tell you about the brooch now," she said quietly. "I took it and I put it on my dress. Then I went outside and walked down the road to the bridge. I wanted to look at the brooch again, so I took it off my dress. It shone in the sun and was very beautiful. But then it fell from my hand, down to the bottom of the river."
"You're a very bad girl, Anne," Marilla said angrily.
"I'm sorry," said Anne. "Please, can I go to the party now?"
"The party?" cried Marilla. "Of course you can't go."
"But Marilla," said Anne, "you wanted to know about the brooch, so I told you. Now please, can I go to the party?"
"No," said Marilla, and went out. Anne fell on her bed and began to cry. Marilla went downstairs with a very sad heart. Maybe Mrs. Lynde was right about Anne, she thought. After lunch, Marilla wanted to go for a walk. She took her coat from the closet. Then she saw something on her coat. It was her beautiful brooch. "What's this?" thought Marilla in surprise. "Oh, I remember now. I put the brooch on this coat." She went to Anne's room. "Anne, why did you tell me that story this morning?" she said. "The brooch is here on my coat."
"I wanted to go to the party," said Anne sadly. "You wanted me to tell you about the brooch, so I had to think of a story."
Marilla began to laugh. "I'm sorry, Anne," she said. "I made a mistake. Now get ready for the party."
"Oh, Marilla," cried Anne, "isn't it too late?"
"No," answered Marilla. "It's only 2:00. Wash your face and put on one of your new dresses. I'll give you some food for the party." When Anne came home that evening, she was very happy.
"Oh, Marilla, the party was wonderful,"
she said.